An Inspector Calls is a play by J.B. Priestley that centres around the apparent suicide of a working-class woman, Eva Smith, and the Berlins' role in her death. The play opens in 1912 on a spring evening. The Berlin family are celebrating their daughter Sheila's engagement to a wealthy man about town, Gerald Croft. The family are very pleased with themselves, very cosy and intimate, and then Inspector Goole arrives ready to expose their wrongdoings and the upper-class society in which they belong in the Edwardian era. An Inspector Calls is a post-war play that explores Priestley's views and desires for a more equal society. Priestley himself was born into a working-class family and served as a hero in World War I, which helped him write accurately about the causes and consequences of the actions of the Edwardian era. Priestley sought to have more morality in politics, and through the play explores social class division and socialism and capitalism through the use of his characters. The play was set in 1912 in the Edwardian era, but Priestley wrote and published the play in 1945 to a post-war audience who knew of the anguish and pain and the suffering that had occurred due to the two world wars. Mr. Berlin can be seen as the embodiment of capitalism, the very values that Priestley seeks to criticise. Mr. Berlin is a selfish and arrogant character and does not appreciate being confronted by the inspector about his role in Eva Smith's death. Mr. Berlin is a laughable, foolish character to the 1945 audience, as Priestley fills the play with dramatic irony to show him as this. Mr. Berlin says the Titanic is unsinkable, absolutely unsinkable. This shows his outdated and traditional rigid views and can also point to his values of capitalism, which are very traditional, outdated, and foolish. Mrs. Berlin is the wife of Mr. Berlin, described as cold and her husband's social superior, which makes the audience think that Mrs. Berlin comes from a higher social status than Mr. Berlin. She is the mother of Sheila and Eric Berlin, so the divide between the older and younger generation is quite obvious towards the end of the play. Mr. and Mrs. Berlin both have capitalist and traditional values, whereas towards the end of the play, Sheila and Eric both change their views to become more socialist. Mrs. Berlin is quite neglectful of the working class and seeks to protect her family in their bubble. At the beginning of the play, we see Sheila and Eric as both immature, young, and naive. They are protected by their parents and do not have much of an opinion of their own. Sheila is engaged to Gerald Croft, a wealthy man about town, as I mentioned before. Eric is quite a young, immature man who drinks quite a lot, gets into trouble, and by the end of the play, we see great development and progress in both of these characters. This is Priestley's hope for a better future for the younger generations, as they're more impressionable, and his hopes for social reform become very obvious. Inspector Goole can be seen as Priestley's mouthpiece, a character used to convey Priestley's desire for social reform. He promoted values of community, justice, responsibility, and defends and investigates the apparent suicide of Eva Smith, a working-class girl. Inspector Goole challenges the Berlin family on their capitalist attitudes and actions and seeks to bring them to full accountability for their actions. The play itself is split into 3 acts. Priestley's use of stage directions are very effective in setting the scene for the acts. The opening stage directions in particular really give the audience a really good understanding of what the Berlin family are like, what their home life is like, and where they are in their life currently. Act 1 opens with Sheila and Gerald's engagement and the celebration that follows. Mr. Berlin is very happy about this engagement as he sees it more as a business deal rather than a relationship for his daughter. Mr. Berlin and Gerald seem to have a good relationship. They have a lot in common, stemming from the capitalist values that Priestley criticises. The inspector then arrives and seeks to interrogate each of the Berlin members of the family to find out their role in the death of Eva Smith. The inspector is all-knowing and already knows what answers he will get. He would like to bring to light to the audience the actions of the Berlin family. We find out that Mr. Berlin has fired Eva Smith from her job, making her redundant, unemployed, and at a loss for money. We then find out that Gerald has had an affair with Eva Smith, who he knew as Daisy Renton, and cheated on Sheila in the previous summer. We find out Sheila had Eva Smith sacked from her job at a clothing store after Eva laughed at her trying on a dress. This shows the selfish and arrogant attitudes of the upper class in the Edwardian era. In Act 2, the cracks in the Burling family are beginning to show. Mr. and Mrs. Burling deny any wrongdoing in Eva Smith's death. However, Sheila instantly regrets her actions in Millwards. She didn't want to get Eva Smith sacked, she didn't know her position, and she instantly feels sorry for her actions. Mrs. Burling, we find out, has refused Eva Smith charity. She was pregnant, alone, unemployed, and poverty-stricken. However, we do find out the father of Eva Smith's baby is Eric. Mrs. Burling is unaware of this and claims she might have given her charity if she had have known. Eric comes through the door at the end of Act 2, a cliffhanger which leaves the audience in their seats as they wait to discover Eric's reaction. In Act 3, the family are now divided between the older generation and the younger generation. We've got Mr. and Mrs. Burling against Sheila and Eric, who both feel responsible for their actions. Priestley's mouthpiece, the inspector, gives a final monologue which preaches to the audience and the characters about their actions and warns them about going back to the capitalist values and attitudes that were once in the Edwardian society. He preaches about the anguish, the suffering, the pain of the wars and how we shouldn't return to that. Priestley leaves the audience open to question about the actual authenticity of the inspector as the characters question his actual motives. They wonder if he was actually real, if he was there. We get a telephone call at the end that suggests the inspector was actually perhaps a ghost, foreshadowing and pre-warning the Burlings of their actions and their consequences.